Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another exciting edition of IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Vaughn Smith, and this is our Cisco Cloud Fundamentals series, and we are coming back with a little bit more in our ACI basics. And here to help us explain everything and demonstrate is Mr. Ronnie Wong. How are you?
I am doing well, Vaughn. Thank you again for joining me as we continue on here through our Cisco Cloud Fundamentals. There's no doubt that there's a lot here in the ACI basics itself, and that actually kind of lets you know something, right? You're just scratching the surface, but this is the wave of the future. SDN and ACI is actually something that you want to become familiar with. So the realm of networking programmability, if you haven't looked at it, make sure you take a look at it as you continue on in your studies. With Cisco or any other thing that's coming on, especially in networking infrastructure, you're going to see that network programmability is going to be a huge part of your future. Now, as we jump back in, let's make sure that we understand where we picked up from. Okay, so if we take a look at my screen, Vaughn. Okay, last thing that we were talking about in the previous episode, in the part one, is that we were talking about this idea of how we expand out this network. Well, you don't just expand out by adding in devices. You first have to know what you need to do. So if you actually need to add in additional bandwidth, you know that you need to add in additional spine devices. If you know that you need to add in additional ports, okay, so that you can have more and more servers, right? Then you know that you add in more leaf devices as well. Because everything in here is essentially stable and structured. It's very deterministic, like we talked about. You're really only 2 hops away, regardless, right? Here's 1, here's 2, from getting outside your network or even from any other device. So Vaughn, if there was another server over here on this switch, well, remember that it actually leaves this switch here, goes here, so the 1, 2, and then you're on that server if there was another one right there as well, okay? So everything is pretty much right there. It makes it very deterministic, very easy for us to connect into. But Vaughn, what makes all this happen and what we have to focus in on is this idea of what we call the ACI fabric, okay? And the ACI fabric ends up working on a couple of different layers for us as what it does. So what is everything involved in here? It's normally made of 3 separate components when you start talking about ACI itself, right? The application-centric infrastructure, okay? The first thing that it's normally built on as far as the physical aspect of it is something like a Nexus 9000, okay? These are specialized, super high-end switches from Cisco that's designed for the data center itself, and it runs a specific type of OS, okay? So even though it's called a Nexus and it can run the NSOX, but if you're actually connecting it in for the ACI, okay, the way that you do so is you connect that Nexus 9000 switch, okay, into the ACI fabric, which is another term we'll talk about here in a moment, okay? But it connects in through something that we call the ACI Fabric OS. I know, you can't believe it, but that's actually the name of it. It's actually ACI Fabric OS is what this operating system is. So it's a variation, of course, of the NXOS for the Nexus operating system, but that's what it actually connects into the ACI fabric with. But that's essentially the underlying hardware physical infrastructure that we're talking about. The next one is what you see right here on the screen in the square that I drew here, or the rectangle, I guess, technically, okay, is that we have what we call an APIC, which is the Application Infrastructure Controller itself. So the Application Infrastructure Controller, which I don't know why I can't say it for right now, okay, it is what helps us to provision policies to anything that's actually connected to the ACI fabric. Now, this is something that's actually neat because if you think of more devices you connect in, an APIC can actually connect to all of them and control all of them if you actually need them to. Sometimes you only need them to control a portion of it instead. So how do you actually make it just do that instead of actually just controlling every device that's out there? Well, the APIC can actually help us to be able to do that. Also, this is where, once again, the APIC is what issues what we call the idea of declarative statements, okay, instead of imperative statements. Declarative statements say, hey, firewall, this is what I need you to do. It doesn't say, firewall, here's how you do it, okay? It tells the firewall, here's what needs to be done, and if it's actually running that ACI, it can do it for us.
It reminds me of like, it is imperative that you get this done. You must do this.
Yeah. So the idea of the imperative, right, it says it's the micromanagement, right? This is the steps you got to take to do it. Declarative says, Vaughn, here's what I need done, and then you just do it.
I'm just making a statement.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean you have to follow it.
Right. Well, it just means, yeah, you're going to do it. Okay. So, but you do it your way. And that way it actually works because, Vaughn, once we get into this realm where we're adding in different components from different vendors, right? One vendor may implement something, a policy that we have in one way. Vaughn, another vendor actually says, well, if you do it that way, it's not going to work. So that's where all of a sudden, it's like, well, how do we actually make that work? ACI just says, here's what I'm expecting to see done. And, this particular component from vendor A, you do it your way. This one from vendor B, you do it your way because I'm just saying it needs to be done and you just need to tell me about it when it's done, okay? And that way we don't run into that problem where some devices are configured, some aren't, okay? So that's where the APIC also helps us out to be able to understand on how to do that. And then overall, we can, of course, connect then to the idea of the ACI fabric. The ACI fabric just pretty much means it's the entire ecosystem of our devices here. So the APIC acts as the intermediary, okay, between the idea of the different components that we've talked about. So the idea of the Nexus 1000 is being the underlying hardware, but also the devices that we tend to run in our network as well that are ACI enabled as well. The Cisco ASAs, if you're also running VMware vCenter, okay, if you're actually doing something like that, if you're running the System Configuration Virtual Machine Manager, I was trying to remember Microsoft terminology for the SCVMM. I know too many acronyms sometimes, very much so. And then even a third-party type of orchestration software, it is the idea here that all that actually falls underneath that rubric of what we call the idea of the ACI fabric itself. So those components, the ACI fabric, the idea of the APIC, the controller itself, and the Nexus 9000s in terms of hardware, all of that actually combines together to really bring us the entirety of the ACI solution to make us do what we needed to, okay? So Vaughn, when we put it all together, here's what essentially it looks like, okay? So once we get that, whatever we actually want to be able to do, the orchestrator essentially makes those declarative statements. The API, the APICs here, control that. So it actually allows us to communicate. Notice that we might have the spine switches, okay, that are ACI enabled. We might have those leaf switches that are also ACI enabled as well. I know you can't really see that, but I tried to draw the symbol that are pretty close to what they actually have too, okay, for the ACI. So those are also that way. We also have what we call data plane objects or elements is what you tend to hear, technically elements here. Whether it's a firewall, software load balancer, a bare metal hypervisor type of thing, or whether you're actually even running routers. And if you need to directly control VMs, you can, of course, use some type of VM manager like we talked about. VMware vCenter, SCVMM, you name it, all that can actually be controlled together in terms of the APIC itself. Now, Vaughn, I drew it together in terms of a cluster because in a data center or inside of a cloud environment, you're probably not going to see single APICs here, okay? They're actually going to be clustered together to work and do what we need them to do as well, okay? So, Vaughn, this is the time where it's like, all right, so I kind of understand that. We now need to take a look and see how it works, okay? And in the previous episode, I made a complete verbal plunder here of things when I said, we're going to actually show you how it works in the working. Well, that's exactly what we're going to do here is we're going to do a demonstration, and I couldn't just pull out the word demonstration. Don't ask me why. I just couldn't do it, okay? So we're back into my particular environment here that I have set up for us, okay? And I've actually got two different sites that work with. Now, I'm not actually trying to set up everything, okay? But Vaughn, what I'm trying to do is show you some of the different terminology and some of the different components and how they're actually done. So Vaughn, if I want to manage a single fabric itself, okay, we actually focus in on one APIC. So here's an example of the idea of the APIC itself. So I'm simply going to log in, and I'll zoom in here in a moment. I'm just typing in my credentials. It's not so essential that you see that here for a moment, and then I'll zoom in like that. And we'll just take a look at a few different things. So Vaughn, right away when we take a look at this, right? So this is the one for New York. So I have my fabric here in New York, and I can go over here and see if I have any tenants that are actually here, okay? I can see the actual fabric itself. Take a look at the topology if I wanted to. There's nothing really here right now because there's not really a big topology. But we do have what we call a single pod, which means it does have something in it. And so Vaughn, if I kind of scroll out, you can see just in the physical interfaces here, I have 792 uplinks, okay? but it looks like 8 are active. Downlinks, 10. Total of 888 uplinks that are actually available to us there. Let's see, is there anything actually connected? Let's take a look at the topology. Devon, the neat thing about the APIC is it can actually take a look and show you. Here it is in New York's center. Even though we're actually connected into a single APIC, here's the clustered APIC that we're talking about. Oh, look at that, Vaughn. Leaf.
There's a leaf. Just like you were
Yep.
talking about their spine and leaf model.
Right. And here's the spine. Now, here they have it, of course, inverted the way that I showed you, but of course they would. For me, it actually makes sense that you connect up, but for them, they show it however they want to. And notice, Vaughn, these apex, they're not connected to the spine. Even though they're controlling everything, they're always connected to the leaf objects. We don't really connect anything to the spine itself to run anything. They're always connected to the leaf objects to help us out to do so. Okay?
And when you're hovering over that, the leaf, this is just
Right.
giving you more information about each one of them.
Right?
Okay, so those little icons.
Yeah, let me see if I can move over a little bit so you can see that. There we go. Yep. So all these are essentially notifications. So I can't hover and do that. So an X, of course, means bad. The orange type of exclamation point tells you, hey, something you should note. And then there's a little yellow kind of warning. And then 9 is just informational. Okay. Or the exclamation point with the green. It's just informational here.
That's nice
Gives
to
you a
know.
name, yeah. And it shows you how these devices are actually functioning just as a glance. Same thing over here too. So you can see, Vaughn, on this one, my APIC, it shows me, oh, there's something that's actually really heavy here, and I can show you this in a moment. Oh, notice my memory here is taking up 86%. So it's actually saying, hey, Ronnie, you want to do something about that. Same thing over here. Same thing over here. So we can see the topology of things. Now, Vaughn, because I have a multi-site, I don't have to actually configure everything here. But if I had a single site, this is where you'd begin the configuration. You configure the idea of what we call a tenant. Okay. Now, a tenant, essentially for us, right, is essentially everything that we want managed underneath one management frame, is what we talk about, right? All the devices that have a single common type of management and infrastructure that we want to put together, we'll call that a particular tenant. Now, there are default tenants that are already here. We're not going to get in this because this is more in the admin side of things, but the default ones are common, infra, and management, okay? And here's one that I had created a little bit earlier called Tesla, okay? Just made up the name here. That's what I did. So those are actually available for us inside of this tenant as well. Now, I didn't make that there, but I wanted to show you how that's made. So, Vaughn, what if I have 2 sites, which I do? I have a San Francisco site and I have a New York site. So if I go ahead and log in to this idea of the multi-site, well, this is just an aggregator here. And if I can remember the password as the key. Oh, which I can't. I always forget that password. And then I'll zoom in to help us out, okay? So Vaughn, on this one, it doesn't really look much more exciting, okay? But if you do have multiple sites, it's always better that you actually do it from this central aggregator of things that you have available. So here on sites, see if it actually pulls anything in. And you'll see, Vaughn, there's my 2 sites that I already have ready to go and able to be configured as well. Now, I already configured them so that we could actually take a look at them a little bit earlier here. But in terms of tenants, if I wanted to add in another tenant, I could simply add tenant here. And remember, then I just type in a name. And this time we'll be the bad guy here. We'll call it Edison instead. Let me make sure Tesla, because I deleted this out so that we could see Tesla. Okay. Now, Vaughn, if I just create a tenant and I go, all right, so I could actually just put it in a single site if I want to. But I said, hey, Tesla, they're going to actually have their companies all over the place. I can actually spread that over a couple of different sites. So I could put it in my New York and San Francisco center as well. And then from that point, I save it. And now it will take a few minutes, but this will actually, again, push out and do what we actually need it to do and make sure that it's actually done. So you can see where it's actually been assigned to 2 sites here. And we already saw it was already there, but I had deleted it out earlier. It just hasn't taken the time to update and do everything else that we needed to. So simply, that's the idea of a tenant, okay? Now, once we get into some of the other things that we want to do, is that for us to manage everything and do all the things that we need to, we're going to create what we call a schema, okay? A schema essentially allows us to do this, and we'll go ahead and add a schema. And now it's going to say, hey, what do you want to be able to do? I'm going to rename the schema for right now. We'll just call this one uh, Layer 3 Schema is what we'll call it. And for template 1, I'm just going to change this over on this side, and we'll call it SF and New York. Do that, and then I'll start building the schema. So now that I've clicked on that where it says to build the schema, saying, hey, who's going to be the tenant in both of these locations here? Over on the far right-hand side, and they don't make it very easy for us to find. It's kind of even almost grayed out here, Vaughn. So it's hard. And now you can see where Tesla showed up here. And now, Vaughn, it actually has now created inside of here for New York and San Francisco a couple of different things, right? So overall, the tenant itself is now actually inside of this particular template that we've created. Now, Vaughn, there's a couple of different things that we want to point out here, too. So there is what we call the idea of an application profile, okay? Now, in terms of the application profile itself also has what we call EPGs, which is endpoint groups that we have, okay? So when we start talking about that idea of that endpoint group, this is actually helps us because we can reuse those groups as we need to, okay? But we can add something in here and create the idea of a profile, okay? So we can do that. We can also have contracts. Contracts essentially is the networking part of how endpoint groups communicate using the traffic rules that are available. The other term that you should be familiar with, which is strange because they call this out on, for the exam, they don't call it a VRF, even though you should know the term VRF. But on this one, Vaughn, this is what they call a context, okay? This essentially is your layer 3 boundary. When you talk about a private network within the tenant itself, this is our VRF that we want to actually take a look at. There's also the idea of what we call a bridge domain. A bridge domain is how our layer 2 traffic actually ends up working for us as well within the context of our VRF, okay? And then there's filters, access control lists essentially is what we have. And then external EPGs, these are, of course, the endpoint groups that are outside of my fabric as well, okay? So that's how that ends up working. Now, before we go on and we create anything in that particular big template there, I can also create sites if I want to. And so here, Vaughn, I'll actually add in for that template here, what sites do I really want to manage? I can actually add both of them in there. And now I'll say, all right, that's fine. We'll go ahead and do that. Save that. And now you'll see that it's not exactly prepared for anything yet, but you can see that it's added in for right now in that entire template. So that means anything that I configure up here, Vaughn, because we also have attached it now to New York and to San Francisco sites, that means it'll push out to those particular locations too, okay? So that's what we can do. Now, the other thing, of course, as we do this, is that we can change the grouping here as well to make that work. Let me see if I can actually do that. Let me add in another template. And here I'll change this one to New York. Build the schema here. Scroll back out and we'll find Tesla again. So if I wanted to just affect New York, I could do so as well, okay? And I could say I just want to affect the New York side of Tesla's, of what they're doing. I can build another one here for San Francisco. Just do SF because I'm getting tired of typing. I think I clicked on it. There we go. Here you go. You actually see Tesla as well. And now we've actually got those things that are ready to go here. If I right click on New York, I can select add site, and then I can say, all right, so New York site, I'm just going to add New York. And then San Francisco's, I can add in San Francisco as well. And that now allows me to be able to do that. You'll see if I expand out New York, you'll see that where I actually have them both. So here's the common grouping in between them I need to deploy, between both of them, okay? But then if I just need to deploy the New York side, if I need to deploy to the San Francisco side, we can see that as well, okay? All that, once you actually do that, okay, that's where you can actually start working and start doing some other things here, okay? So once we get that going, I apparently had expanded that one out a bit more. Let me go back up here. Let's see. Yeah, let's try New York first. All right, so Vaughn, if I want to create an application profile, I now just click on that. And then everything is configured over in the right-hand side. So here again is an application profile, and we'll just call this one app. So this is just an example so that we can do that. And hold on, my screen is now locked for one reason or another. It's not allowing me to expand out. Okay, I'm going to hit save. And now it shows me that I had actually saved something to the schema for New York as well. And once I get, oh wait, why didn't it? It didn't add. All right, let me try it again. That's what I want to do. App, at least I thought it was going to do that. Then you can scroll down here and add it to the layer 2 if I had created one. See if I can zoom out. I forget I have to do it this way. Okay. So then I type in here and I can call this one app BD. So that I'm actually creating for layer 2. I forgot. I got to actually hit something here. App dash BD. There's a little tiny red arrow or up arrow. Click on that. Down now adds it in, and you get this little flag that tells you it's now been added in. Look at it from the template is what it's actually been added into. So that now actually shows up here as app. Then I can scroll down and I can create that. And look, notice the bridge domain has now been created for layer 2 as well. If there is your layer 3 and you want to create that, this is where you would do it too. Okay, so you can actually create here. We'll call this one VRF1. Add that in. And now with my VRF1, do I want my entire layer 2 network to stretch out across it? If I don't, I want to keep them separate. I can just go ahead and change that, and it gives me a warning saying, are you sure this will cause havoc? I can say yes. And then from that point, you just continue to fill out some of the other things that you need to do to make sure everything actually starts applying. And all of a sudden, you'll have this template, and I didn't create a big one. I created a fairly simple one here. But then you actually go in and you have to configure all the rest. Now, we're not in a configuration show, so I'm not trying to take you through everything here. But now, Vaughn, anything that's in the app, okay, including the VRF, including the bridge domain, that gets pushed out to New York and also San Francisco if I wanted to. But right here is actually saying New York. I can deploy it to the sites, and now I get a check mark like this that says, hey, what's going to be deployed to that site? And let's see. It tells me it's now successfully deployed. So I've now pushed it out to that center. Okay. So those are some of the different things that you can actually end up seeing and working with as well. Okay. Now, you're probably not going to get too heavily involved in this until you get into the administration side, right? The cloud administration side. But again, I've been talking for a couple of episodes without actually showing you something here. But know that the ACI actually works that way. It doesn't matter what the equipment is, Vaughn, at New York or at San Francisco site. If it runs ACI, we can communicate with it. We can actually deploy all these things and make them work in the fashion that we want them to be able to do so. Okay. So let me see if there's any other thing that I actually didn't mention. I think I mentioned just about everything that we needed to make sure that we have that. Now, there are some IP addresses that if you do have multi-sites, you have to make sure that they are paired up correctly. But that, again, is more in the configuration side, which would be towards more the administration, of course, of the cloud than the idea of just showing the fundamentals here. But take a look at the at the terminology, and I'll have those terminologies in the show notes itself. So for those of you that are IT Pro TV members, right, you'll have access to that, and I've kind of made sure that you have the terminology ready to be able to understand what's happening here. So Vaughn, that should give us a good understanding of the idea of how the ACI is meant to work for us as well, and that means that there's for us. This should end our entire fourth domain objective, okay? Unless I find another objective that I didn't cover and we'll have to go back and add in some. But I believe I've covered everything in the fourth domain. And that means we are now ready to move on to our fifth and final domain here for our Cloud Fundamental series.
All right, 4 down, 1 to go. Sounds like a plan, Stan. Actually, wait, you're Ronnie.
Yeah,
But anyways, thank you so much for joining us. But we're going to go ahead and sign off for IT Pro TV. I've been your host, Vaughn Smith.
And I'm Ronnie Wong.
We'll see you soon.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.